Thank you, Brendan. Again, welcome to First Steps in Leading Change. My name is Miguel Escobar, and what I'm hoping that we will have tonight is a conversational presentation. I'm going to have discussion questions at various points and throughout the webinar, in part because change is such a complex topic, and as you saw, I hope in the chat box just a few moments ago, people are doing all sorts of different kinds of changes. So we're going to have to take these general principles and kind of contextualize them for our respective congregations. My role here at ECF is I'm a Managing Program Director for Leadership Resources and Communications. And ECF is an independent lay-led organization whose mission is to strengthen congregations through vision and planning, leadership development, and raising financial resources for ministry. We know we're being effective when we see lay and clergy leaders working together to transform the church, so that's significant emphasis. Healthy, vital, vibrant Episcopal communities of faith, when we're building opportunities for Christian stewardship, meaningful Christian stewardship and effective fundraising, and we're exploring innovative mission-based ways to be the church of the future. So I hope you will join us as we do all those things in tonight's webinar. And as always, we like to begin these webinars with a prayer. So let's just take a moment and center ourselves and begin. So, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and wisdom to know the difference, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have had it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen.
Amen.
I think that's a helpful prayer when in the midst of thinking about change and leading change. So tonight's presentation is one in 4 parts. We're going to be beginning with just some self-reflection about where this change is coming from. I'm going to make a distinction between the authority to make a change versus leading change. Then we're going to proceed to the first 3 steps of leading change. And it begins with discerning a shared vision, a hopeful vision. Too often, we leaders are the only people in the congregation who see the need for change, and discerning a shared vision of what the church would look like once that change has been accomplished is really critical for any major change process. A second step is building a team to lead the change. We'll look at 4 different categories of stakeholders in any change process, and we will also talk about some basic principles when it comes to identifying and recruiting people who will help to lead a change. And then thirdly, we are going to talk about sustaining a sense of urgency in the midst of leading change. I think one of the things that many people describe, including many church leaders describe, is just the amount of inertia that is around change. Another way of putting that is people just don't want to change. And so it takes a certain amount of urgency and a certain amount of sustained energy around change over the long haul. And we want to talk about different ways to keep that energy up as you proceed through this process. Finally, we will look at next steps. We're going to take all these ideas and try to identify some practical ways forward for the immediate future. So let's just begin with some self-reflection by thinking about our example of change or the change that you are in the midst of leading, and ask ourselves where this is coming from.
Miguel, if you could just back up a little bit, I think we were having some audio interference and we were kind of missed the beginning of this slide.
Okay. Do you want me to begin from this slide right here?
Yes.
Okay. So we'd like to begin just by doing a little bit of self-reflection. And I would ask you to just think about the example of change that is happening in your congregation. And ask yourself, where is this change coming from? If you're a member of the vestry, or if you're a member of the clergy, you have canonical authority to make certain changes. And there's a lot of benefit to this canonical authority when leading change. It's faster. There's some unilateral decision-making power. It often has a very clear, straightforward process. But in many instances, not all, because you're working within a community of faith, leading change is a bit more of a windy and collaborative road. And so that's the type of change that I'm going to be talking about particularly today. What does it look like to lead change in a community of faith where there are many, many different stakeholders and groups involved, where it's not just the vestry who you have to get approval from, but also the elders of the church who are the unofficial elders of the church, as well as many other groups. This can be a somewhat frustrating process in so much as it's a little bit more circuitous, and it requires ongoing prayerful discernment of a shared vision. It's oftentimes slower, with an emphasis placed on building consensus, and it's frequently a little bit unclear. There's a lot of steps forward and 2 steps back. And I'm sure that I'm not saying anything that's surprising to you at all. If you've had experience working in this sort of context and leading change, I mean, what else has been your experience in doing this? Along with that question, I would ask you to consider, when is it appropriate to make a unilateral change? What's an example of an instance in which that type of change is appropriate? Personnel changes. Particularly in instances, let's say, where there needs to be an immediate change based on performance or based on staff, yes. Right. Okay, I see some liturgical changes. I think, the qualifier there is definitely some. Certainly where someone or a core ministry is in danger, yes. Those are all examples of sort of unilateral changes that where the canonical authority certainly exists for that reason, is to make a rapid decision. For the sake of tonight, that's not necessarily the type of change that we're talking about. I'm talking about a different sort of major change that requires collaboration and involvement from the wider community. So can you think of a time when a clergy person or vestry might have the canonical authority to make a unilateral change, when it would nevertheless be best to work toward consensus? I see multiple people are typing. Yes, I was just going to say, the classic example of this would be worship changes, major changes in worship. It is certainly within the canonical authority of a rector to make changes in worship, but worship is something that's, including service times, is experienced and unofficially, I suppose, owned by the entire community. And so if it's something that doesn't need to be done immediately, there's a lot of value to, you know, holding conversations, checking in with others, moving a little bit more slowly, and having this more collaborative process on this. So thank you for your comments there. And Lynette's comment is a great example of doing that. So these are all just, I think, things to start reflecting on as we think about the type of change that we're leading in our congregation. And now I just want to talk about the first steps in leading a change process. We're going to begin by talking about a hopeful vision. Our argument, and it's not just our argument, but change leadership experts posit that leading change needs to be rooted in a positive vision of what your church, your neighborhood, or world will look like once the change is completed. So again, opportunity here for self-reflection. We need to think about the rationale that we're presenting to ourselves and others about why this change is necessary. And we can ask ourselves, how can we make this rationale more hopeful? Is there an opportunity here to make it more hopeful? A second step is acknowledging that we are not going to be able to do it alone, and then we need to build a strong team, a coalition to lead this change. And I'm going to speak specifically about stakeholder categories and making sure that you have different groups within your congregation involved. And then thirdly, this is oftentimes an overlooked piece, which is kind of the energy factor. Change processes, especially collaborative change processes, can be a long-term effort. And so we have to figure out ways to sustain some energy and a sense of urgency around the need for change. In no way does this reflect all the steps that are required for leading a change. Various experts would say that there's anywhere between 8 to 10 steps. And if you want to look at one expert in particular, I would suggest John Cotter and his book, Leading Change. I'll reference it a little bit later, and you'll see the title of the slide. But these are some first steps. And that's what we're going to be able to talk about, I think, in this hour. So let's begin by this idea of a hopeful vision. In the Episcopal Church, we oftentimes use the word discernment, and we tend to use it so much that it can mean many, many things. I think it's instructive to know that the etymology of discernment has to do with the process of sifting, sifting for gems, for instance. When we gather as a team to talk about the need for change, if it's a change that's been held off or avoided for a long time, we should know that there's going to be a lot of stuff that comes up. And we're going to have to sift through that stuff for the hopeful bits of it. So one of the gems that we need to be searching for in the midst of all this stuff is a hopeful vision of what our church or world would look like once the change has been accomplished. And we're going to have to probably dig around a bit, go over and over it again. But I do think we'll be able to start finding some pieces that will comprise this hopeful vision. And that's what a vision is. A vision for change is defined as a hopeful picture of the future that describes what things will look like when the change has been accomplished. So again, take a moment to think about the change that you're leading, and ask if you have a hopeful picture, and if you're presenting a hopeful picture, to the congregation of what your church will look like once that's been accomplished. I noticed in the chat box a few moments ago when I asked people to type in a kind of summary of what it is that what type of change they're leading. Some people noted that they're trying to become more connected to the community. So is there a picture that you're painting for your congregation of what your congregation would look like if it was more connected to the community? What would the congregation look like in that instance? I mentioned John Cotter and his work in leading change. His argument is that a hopeful vision plays a really critical role in directing, aligning, and inspiring actions over the long term of a large number of people. And that without that vision, this effort sort of dissolves and becomes pretty confusing over the time. So it's going to be a critical piece that anyone leading change needs to return to over and over again. If you had a chance to read the article called A Blueprint for Change, it's about St. Augustine's Church in Brooklyn, New York. And one of the reasons why I asked folks to take a moment to read it is I thought it was really interesting the way in which they identified 3 foci for what they wanted their church to become. And they also identified pictures of what the church would look like once it had accomplished this. So they had 3 foci. One was they put spirituality first. And their picture, in a certain way, was 1 Corinthians 12, that all the members of the church were recognized as the body of Christ. I was sort of reading between the lines there, but it sounds as if they were coming from a kind of a father who knows best model. They were coming out of that. And they wanted one in which the laity and clergy were much more working together for the good of the church. They also wanted to emphasize mission and ministry, and for them that looked like community engagement. A third emphasis was finances, and they wanted to make sure that their finances were sound and growing. I think it's telling that they prioritized to just a few images for the congregation and continue to offer this up over the course of 10 years of this change. So again, let's have a conversation. I'm wondering if you can think of a congregational example where a vision of change is offered that's rooted in the opposite of hope, in negativity. Have you ever heard of a time in which someone has said, we need to change because of X reason, and that reason is the opposite of hopeful, I guess? Yes. If we don't get more members and more money, we will die. Exactly. Yes, exactly. Even when that is true, that is not a message that's going to sustain the energy and spirit of people involved. The classic example that I'm always struck by, and I'm surprised by how often this happens, is in the midst of a stewardship campaign, which is a sort of mini change campaign every year, when the message is not we need to raise money to do XYZ amazing ministries for our church that make such and such an impact, but rather we need to do this ministry or we are going to have to shut down. That's not a positive reason. And even sometimes when it works in the short campaign, it really doesn't work in a long campaign of change. Okay, another great example. Yeah. So this is probably more of a rhetorical question and something for us just to think about. What would make your vision for change more hopeful? Is there a way that you could frame it that in a way that is more inspiring and paints a picture for the community? I included, again, Cotter's categories for what constitutes a strong vision. It's one that's imaginable, hopeful, desirable, feasible, so it's still based in reality, focused, flexible enough to incorporate adjustments over the long time, and communicable. And what he means by, I think, communicable is that it's not framed in language that's so specific, let's say, to the Episcopal Church, that someone who's from the outside won't be able to understand it, that it's something that's immediately understood. Yeah. Great. Okay. And that question, this last question, connects again to that list. Does this vision for change pass those sorts of requirements that Cotter describes? As people are typing, I'm going to give another example from a parish, St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Cleveland, Ohio. And this comes from the Reverend David Bargetzi, who's the rector there. This is a congregation in inner city Cleveland, Ohio. And in 2000, the congregation was in a place that many congregations find themselves in, which is that the membership really didn't look like the wider neighborhood that surrounded it. And one of the reasons that David was hired was to lead a change process to, well, change that. So the change was clearly identified, and he had certainly the kind of the backing of the congregation to go ahead and do this. What he did, though, was he gathered a team, the congregation, and they began to do a needs assessment in the neighborhood of what was needed there. And I think the critical piece here is that over time, through many meetings, they realized that they were coming to a shared vision of what the church would look like if it started to incorporate more people from the neighborhood. They then did a really interesting further practice of imagining the practical implications of what happens when people from the wider neighborhood begin to join. So David, the rector, went to the committee of volunteers who was responsible for coffee hour, for instance, and he asked them to imagine what it would be like when people from the neighborhood came and wanted to share their favorite foods with the wider church. How would they be welcomed in the process of doing that? He went to the committee that was responsible for welcoming people and asked them to imagine what it would look like if people from the neighborhood showed up at the door, and asked them to think about how they would respond to these things. It was such a minor practice, of imagination, and yet it laid the groundwork for some really practical changes that maybe a more abstract statement doesn't necessarily allow. So this has been a 14-year-long process, but today St. Luke's is considered to be one of the vibrant Episcopal congregations in the Diocese of Ohio, and they look radically different, as I think this picture really shows. And so it's a very successful example of change. So I want to talk about then the second step, which is developing a strong team to lead change. And the primary tool that I want us all to consider here is what's called a stakeholder analysis. And that sounds more complicated than it really is. The basic premise is that there are 4 types of stakeholders. And if you look at the left-hand side, the left-hand column of this chart, I'm referring to those ultimately responsible for decisions, those who implement or prevent implementation of decisions, those who will be directly affected by outcome, and those who have information and expertise to help in this change process. What I've done is, on the right-hand side, given 2 examples of how a stakeholder analysis would work. So let's just talk about one, the middle column. Let's say a congregation wants to grow their annual operating budget. Well, who's ultimately responsible for that decision? Who needs to be on board with this decision to strengthen the annual operating budget? Certainly the vestry, including the clergy, and the stewardship committee. Who's going to implement this change? Members of the stewardship committee, the staff, and volunteers, the very least. Who's going to be affected? All the members of the congregation, and especially those who have been giving faithfully and have the significant ability to contribute more. And when thinking about who can help lead this change, we shouldn't forget the people in our congregation that have some fundraising background that we can bring into the conversation. So that's I think, a pretty simple example. And I'm sure in your instances it's going to be a little bit more complex. But hopefully these 4 categories will be a way of just starting to list out some names of people who you want to get involved in the change process. I want to talk especially, though, about the second category, which is those who implement or prevent implementation. Because what I've seen, or what we've seen in terms of what oftentimes trips up congregations in these processes, is forgetting this stakeholder category number 2. And I want to give a particular example of an instance where that happened. So there is this one congregation that I'm familiar with that was making a broader effort to be more hospitable to visitors. And that was the change that they wanted to lead within their congregation. And the coffee hour in their parish was located in a dank basement, 2 floors down. You had to leave the sanctuary and then go downstairs. And it was actually a struggle to find where the coffee hour was, period. And so the rector, the new rector, had the great idea of removing some pews from the back of the parish in order to set up coffee hour in the back of the sanctuary. And he followed some of the steps, or he checked in with some of the appropriate groups by getting approval from the vestry and doing a sort of Sunday forum with the congregation in which he laid out why. But he forgot to include the volunteers who had been leading and setting up coffee hour for the past 30 years in this conversation at all. And, you might imagine what happened next, which is that those volunteers sort of boycotted this change and basically said, look, you didn't ask us, you didn't value our opinion, we're no longer doing coffee hour. And so suddenly, the seminarian assistant went from having a wonderful experience leading various ministries to being exclusively responsible for setting up coffee hour for the congregation. And it didn't last. And in the end, coffee hour is still now in that dank basement. So it's a great idea. It was a great idea. It was a well-intentioned vision. But as we all know, when we forget to check in with one of these categories, we can have some problems. So let's just talk about, I'm wondering if we can do a quick, if there would be a volunteer who's available by voice or by phone to offer an example of a change in your congregation, and we could just talk out a stakeholder analysis together. If you'd like to volunteer, there's a raise your hand button at the top of the top bar of the screen.
And so if you've been put on mute or if you muted yourself, we can unmute you if you'd be willing to participate. Don't be shy. This is a fun process.
Okay. I see.
Paul, I think, has raised his hand.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Right. Let's see. All right, Paul. Great. So what is the change that you're leading in your congregation?
What we've got is a congregation that is in a basically older neighborhood. Laredo is got demographic issues in one sense at my congregational level because it's a 98% Hispanic community. Now it's got a lot of people from all walks of life, but Christ Church was a historically more or less Anglo congregation, not entirely, but, and what's happened over the years is it's not really Anglo totally, but it's class-wise, upper class to upper middle class. But our neighborhood is a very mixed neighborhood now with wealthy people, poor people. We've got $1 million homes and people living in trailers a few blocks from there. So broadening our outreach, what we've had to do is go to the existing membership and so we can move the church into our affluent north part of town, but you all love this building, but do you want us to love the neighborhood we're in? Because if we're going to keep this building, we've got to reach this neighborhood as well.
Okay.
Which is some incentive to them because they love the building. But also, I said, most of you lived in this neighborhood. Do you still love the neighborhood? A lot of them moved to the suburbs. And almost all of them who are now in their 70s and some in their 80s have said, I do still love the neighborhood. And I said, well, if we started outreach to the elementary school, started doing more outreach, we'd do a feeding program and really inviting those people to show up on Sunday. Have a lot more piñatas, things like that. Would that really be acceptable to you? I said, because it'll change who we have in the pews. And I said, we're going to get people who are socially not at the depth of the kind of worship we do, that kind of thing. So, and almost all, there are one or two people who are not happy with it, but they're willing to let it happen. I think one of the things is I've been here a long time. See, so I didn't try to make any major changes for 3 years. They wanted to know that I really cared about them. So, now I'm going on 12, so they will sometimes go grudgingly, but it's a lot easier. The flip side of it is they get comfortable. So,
yeah.
Our social classes have changed so much that we are really getting stretched, and I'm seeing some discomfort in people who are very enthusiastic at first. So I'm starting to get a little concerned.
Yeah. Okay. Well, for the sake of this webinar, I'd love to just kind of talk through the 4 categories very, very quickly. When thinking about this change process, who was ultimately responsible for giving the thumbs up? Who did you have to check in with to get the official thumbs up or thumbs down for going ahead or not?
But we had a strategic planning committee, and we invited all of our matriarchs, because we have more matriarchs than patriarchs. They tend to be more, there's a saying in Spanish that the man has the last word, but it's sí querida, yes dear. In my congregation, that's really true. So, but I had to get 3 matriarchs to buy in. I invited them all to be part of the strategic planning process. Only one of them joined, but she was a leader, and I said, I need you to convince the other 2 people. I said, because they love the community of Laredo, they love Christ Church, but socially this is going to be harder for them.
Right. So there's the official leaders, and then there's the also unofficial leaders who need to give your okay, and that is certainly a reality within it, leading any community. How did you engage? Yeah, how did you engage the third stakeholder category, which is everyone who's going to be impacted? So, how did you engage the congregation in this? Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you've already answered the fourth category. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Right. Right. Okay, and then so then the fourth category you already sort of mentioned, which is people who have expertise in leading this. You mentioned the consultant, the strategic consultant, so that's great. I want to go to the second category then, which is the one where a lot of folks trip up on, which is how did you engage those who will implement this change over the long haul? Hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
about that topic in particular, or heard of people speaking to the differences in leading change in urban or rural congregations. So I would be hesitant to sort of make something up off the spot. But given that there are about 30 people and perhaps people with some experience, it would be, I'm wondering if others have some thoughts on this. There is a question in the chat box. How do you introduce anxiety a bit and keep a hopeful vision? I think Mary had a comment, and it's in green, just above. where she noted an example, a specific example of a missed opportunity that simply shows what might have been had the change occurred. And it again reinforces the vision of what you could become. And it also notes delicately that we didn't quite live up to that in that moment. I think it's a great example of how you would introduce this idea without being despairing. I think it's the specificity of it in particular. If you go down the route of saying, in generalizing, we're never going to do X, Y, Z, or we're never going to get there, that verges on being despairing. But it's the specificity of noting a missed opportunity that really is still, I think, hopeful. Okay. Yeah. Other questions or comments? And again, encourage you to raise your hand or if you'd like to speak over the microphone or phone.
Uh-huh. And Maisie, I know you'd asked earlier that you had some questions about your on the outreach ministry and wanting to get youth in the church back and to grow that. I hope that this presentation's been helpful for you in that, but if you still had some questions about that, please let us know. You can either type back in the chat box or raise your hand.
Okay. So I think maybe your microphone is live. So great.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes. A lot of our youth are now in college, and I just know that it would be a great way to help grow the church. Our church has an older congregation. In addition to that, we lost our rector retired 3 years ago. So the church is going through that transition, and I'm a vestry member, and I'm in charge of the outreach ministry. And we're in a neighborhood where there are a lot of homes, and I would like to find different ways to try to reach out to those homes to get some of the youth that are in that area to attend the church and try to help grow the youth ministry in that way. And I just want some advice on how we can, what's some of the things we can implement. I did write some notes down from the last person.
Yeah, I think so. Oftentimes, I'll again to try to keep it connected to some of the steps we just went over. Thinking about the stakeholder categories, when we talk about who's going to be impacted by this change, sometimes we concentrate primarily on the people within the church who are going to be impacted by the possibility of having youth and young adults come into the church. I would also encourage you to remember the youth and young adults themselves as people who are going to be impacted by this change of entering into the congregation. So one step that I would really encourage you to start with in building a team of people to help carry out this change would be to directly engage a few youth, young adults, or more than a few, and just simply ask them what their needs are. What are their needs? What are they searching for? That's a really critical first step, I think, before offering an invitation into the congregation, because they're going to be changed by this experience, and you want to know where they're coming from as well. There are many instances of neighborhood sort of outreach process to a neighborhood that actually forget that the neighborhood is part of the change process. They're sort of abstracted. And so that's a really important thing to kind of keep in mind. Another way is thinking about the neighborhood in terms of, are there local organizations or people who are also working with youth and young adults who would be impacted by this greater focus of your congregation on youth and young adults? And is there a way in which you can engage those individuals in this conversation? Yeah. So it's 8 o'clock, and I know this is there's a lot to continue to talk about. We'll just point out a few upcoming webinars. I hope you'll be able to join us for some additional ones. On this Thursday, there's going to be, speaking of change, a webinar on strategic vision and planning for congregations, as well as a Spanish webinar, a Spanish version of this webinar, actually, for individuals. And we hope that you'll be able to attend. In your email right now, you should have received a survey for this webinar. We'd love for you to just take a moment and give us some feedback about what worked for you, what didn't, what made sense, what didn't, and so that we can continue to improve our presentations. And with that, Brendan, I think that's it. Just thank you for attending, and have a good night.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.